friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here today to share with you my gluten-free pie crust recipe that I've been working on. So while we are not gluten-free, we do have some good friends that we eat dinner with at least twice a month that are, and so it has got me back into working on creating some different gluten-free recipes, and the pie crust is one of the ones I've been most nervous about. So let's start off with this flour recipe. Right here is the jar I keep the blend in. As you can see, it's almost empty, so I have all this stuff out because I'm going to be mixing up a bunch more so I can always have some ready to go, and also so I can keep experimenting with. This basic all-purpose recipe, it can be just three things. It can be either brown or white rice flour, or both if you prefer, potato starch, and either tapioca, arrowroot starch, or even kudzu. This is to make a total of 6 cups. That would be 4 cups of your buckwheat, white, or brown rice flour. For me, I prefer using a blend of the buckwheat and the brown rice. So I'll do 2 cups and 2 cups. Just because I think buckwheat has a lot of nutrients that maybe the brown rice doesn't have. And I've been backing off on using less and less of the white rice flour just because I do believe both of these have more nutrients, but it's also going to depend on the person. Some people may have issues even trying to digest brown rice, so white rice might be the best option. And then to that, you're going to add 1 1/3 cups of your potato starch, and also, by the way, organic is good. So I'll link to the Anthony's, but like I said, you can get this on Azure. So if you shop at Azure Standard, I'll also be putting a link to Azure Standard, and that is also, even though these ones are both also Anthony's, I found I can get the best price, just recently learned, on the buckwheat flour and the rice flours from Azure Standard. So I'll be putting the basic link down below, and just know that anytime you go through that link and you order at least $100 or more, that gives us a $25 credit. So that really helps us out quite a bit. Oh, and for the tapioca starch, or whatever starch you're using, other starch you're using, tapioca, arrowroot, so on, that's going to be 2/3 cup to this recipe. And if you only need 3 cups, just half all that. And also know I'll be putting in the description box down below, and if I remember, I'll try to pin a comment that has this flour blend. So that is great for making cookies and pancakes, and I've used it for that. Now, I tried using this blend alone for making a pie crust just to see how it worked, and I made a chocolate cream pie, and while I did like the flavor, it turned out really good, I found that it just wasn't quite flaky enough, and it was a little on the tough side, and it didn't hold together well at all. I had to actually press it in small pieces into the pie pan. So I did a little more researching, thinking I'm going to have to add something to it, hoping I could get away from adding something like xanthan gum or gaur gum. I do have psyllium husk. There's also things like chia seed. You grind that up, you can add that, and that can be a good binding agent. But what I learned through the research is that when it comes to making a pastry, such as pie crust, none of those are ideal. Your best option, at least from what I found so far, is using some kind of gum. So I asked my friends if they were sensitive to using any kind of gums, and they said no, because a lot of the flour blends that they purchase have xanthan gum or gaur gum added to them. And the great thing about this is that it only takes a tiny bit of this. So I already had xanthan gum because I was using it to experiment with making some gluten-free pasta several years back. For this, you only need a teaspoon per cup. And I found that made a huge difference in the texture and how well the pie crust held together. Let's move on from there with the recipe. So making the pie crust or using it for hand pies, I used 2 cups of the all-purpose gluten-free flour blend plus the xanthan gum. And to that, I add a teaspoon of salt And then my fats. Now the fats you use are going to be up to you. If you're wanting to keep it dairy free, then I recommend going with a good palm shortening, such as, this is my favorite right now. This is an organic palm shortening. And I also look for one that's been sustainably harvested when it comes to a palm shortening. But I have found palm shortening is one of the best things to use for making pie crust. And it gets you away from the Crisco, which I absolutely don't recommend. But for this, I decided to try doing a blend of the shortening with butter. So if you can have dairy, you're not vegan, then I recommend adding a little butter to that. I use a little bit more of the palm shortening than butter, but you can do a half and half blend. The nice thing about the butter is it does, in a lot of cases, it can help assist in making a flaky crust. I find using it alone tends to make the crust a little more tough, but when I do the blend, it seems to turn out perfect. And it adds just a wonderful flavor to the crust as well. So I don't have exact measurements for you on the fat because I've been making pie crust for so many years that I stopped measuring the fats back in my early 20s. And I just add them in because I know what it's supposed to look and feel like. So what I do is I would say put in, let's say if you're using both, to the 2 cups of flour, add in a 1/4 cup of each of the fat or a 1/2 cup of just the palm shortening if you're going dairy free on this, and then just cut it in with a big fork. And then once I have it pretty well cut in where it's small enough that I can start doing this, I do start using my fingers and I do this, I roll it in my hands, and I can tell by the way it feels whether or not it's going to need more shortening. And one of the things I do is once I have it broken up really well is I'll grab the flour and I'll kind of squeeze it, and if it holds together pretty well, and once I release it, if it still holds together, I know it has plenty in it. I'll also kind of mash it like this and go by the feel. If it just really crumbles super easily, a little more shortening is needed. If it a little harder to crumble, then it's usually just right at that point. I know this is just guesswork, but it's one of those things, like I said, I don't have measurements because I just mix it as I go, and I go by the feel. I'm sorry that's not specific for people who need something really specific, but you can also look up various recipes that do give you exact amounts, and I don't know. I don't. And because this is just the way I do things. And then the same applies really to the water, but it's always that way because it's the amount of shortening that's in there is gonna have a little bit of say on how much water you're gonna need to add, but so do the flours. The flours can have big say on how much water you're gonna need to add. So you always, anytime you're making pie crust, once you have that at the right consistency, and if you did the squeeze method to check, make sure it's all broken back up again. You start sprinkling in just a little bit of cold water at a time, mix it with your fork, and then do that again and keep doing that until the dough starts to pull together easily enough. Now, one thing I found with the gluten-free flour is that it needs a little bit more water than your regular wheat flour pie crust needs. And so it may be best to even add enough that it's just a little bit wet when you go to push it together, just a little bit, because what's going to happen is these flours have a tendency to soak up a lot more moisture, and that's why you're going to need a little bit more water. So you can do that, let it even sit for a few minutes before you start working with it. If you start to push it together and then it feels too dry, then just crumble it back up with your fingers or a fork, and then sprinkle a little bit more water, and then push it back together again. The important thing when it comes to making any kind of pie crust, whether it be gluten-free or not, is you don't want to overwork the flour. So you never want to knead it. And when you push it together, always push it together very gently. The less you work that dough, the lighter and flakier it's going to be. So then what I do once I have it all bound together, if I'm making enough for 2 pie crusts, I still am going to cut that in half. Even if I'm going to do a bunch of little shapes out of it, I still recommend cutting it in half and only working with a half of it at a time. And if you want to make little hand pies like I did the other night for our friends, the easiest way to do it then is to take each of those halves one at a time and roll them into a big square, let's say at least 12 inches by 12 by 12, maybe a little bigger than that. I don't know, I didn't measure it. And then cut that into 9 squares, each one of those halves. And so you do 2 slices this way and 2 slices that way. That'll give you a total of 9 squares. And if you do that with each half, then you'll have an equal amount of 18. So that means you can make 9 little ham pies doing it that way. And so what I do then is I'll even up the edges as needed, and then I'll take a little bowl of water and I'll wet around the edges of each of the pieces, and then put whatever filling I'm making. So in this case, I made a blackberry currant filling, and then I just put a spoonful of that in, lay the other piece on top that I'd already wet the edges around it as well, and then with my fingers kind of press that down quickly before the filling wants to run out. Then take a fork, making sure you flour the fork as needed, and press down the edges that way to seal it in good. Then you're also going to want to put a couple of vent holes in the top. So I just take a sharp knife and run it across there. And then you'll bake those. I recommend stoneware if you have it, but whatever kind of cookie sheet you have, for about 400 degrees for about 20 to 30 minutes. It's all going to depend on your oven. You just want to get it nice golden brown on top. And then another option that I did this just for fun was I took a circular, like a wide mouth plastic lid like this for a canning jar, and I used that to cut out little circles to make round shaped ones, which was fun, but you end up with a lot more excess. You can't get as many pieces out of that without having to push it together and roll it out again and then work in the dough more. But what you can do with your excess pieces, besides just throwing them in another pie pan and then baking them so you can have these little snack things, you can take some little small cookie cutters or pastry cutters of some kind and just cut out some cute little shapes, and then carefully wet the bottom of those and stick them on top of your whole pie or your little hand pies that you're making, like you can see I did here in this image. So that's one way. Now, if you're going to do it as a whole pie, which I did the very next day because I still had a lot of pie filling left, then I decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and try making this as a whole pie. So what I did was I took some parchment paper, laid that down on my board here, floured it, rolled my first half out. And I know people are going to have different methods, so please feel free to share this down below, because it's still not going to be as easy to lift up and put into your pie pan. So what I did on this one was I inverted the pie pan over the top of the crust after I had it rolled out. And it was a little tricky, and it seems like it's one of those things that would be easier if you had 3 hands or 4 hands. But I still managed to do it by slipping my hand under the parchment paper and kind of carefully pushing the pie crust up into the pie pan and then flipping it over like this. And then I was able to work my edges. And in that case, I go around and kind of pinch the edges until and kind of work with them until it's even. And then I do the fluted edge with the pinching method like this, which I've shown in other pie crust related videos. That's usually my favorite way to do the edges. It's kind of more of a scalloped edge. Now, instead of putting a solid top on it, I figured it was easier just to cut out pieces. Now, one thing you can do is get, like, I have some heart-shaped cookie cutters that I got at various sizes that I got at a garage sale. And I've made a pie crust just using those and then layering it. As you can see in this image here, I think this is some kind of berry pie, and just layered it around like that. And I think when you're talking gluten-free crusts like that, it's kind of time-consuming doing all that. But because you're working with smaller pieces, there's not as much concern about it falling apart as one big piece. And for the pie I made the very next day, I used several different shapes. I used heart shapes, flower shapes, leaf shapes, and just kind of laid them around on the top and covered it that way. There's no need to cut vent holes because you already got these little spaces, and that worked out really, really good, and it makes a pretty pie topping. So whatever kind of shapes that you have, you can cut things out with. That is one way to do it, and just layer it however you want it and put it in as densely or sparsely as you want to make a topping. And that way you don't have to worry about it falling apart and doing that whole method there. Oh, and then for the pie, you're going to bake for a whole pie, you're going to bake that for a minimum of 40 to 50 minutes at 400 degrees. And at any rate, we've all been very happy with how this pie crust turned out. Everybody loved it the other night. I was so thrilled. Even Patrick likes it when he doesn't like much that's gluten-free. So he was pretty happy with it as well. And so this has just been a real blessing to know that I can still make things when we have our get-togethers with them, and finding more things that I can do that will turn out really good that they can all eat. And I also have several other gluten-free recipes out there. I think I have them in a single playlist. If not, I'll make sure I get it in there so I can link to that whole playlist that I have. So please make sure you check out the links I'll be putting in the description box down below by clicking on more or show more, whatever you see down here below the screen. And again, share your ideas, and don't forget to read through the comments down below. I'm sure there'll be a lot of great information in there. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.